In the early morning hours of December 1993, an older couple was walking down the street to check up on their neighbor. They have not seen her for several days, and so they wanted to make sure that she was okay. But when they approached the house, everything felt very cold and silent. There was not even a smoke from the chimney rising up, and so the couple thought this was very strange, and so knocked on the door and waited for an answer. But none ever came. They noticed the door was already open, and so pushed past through it and walked into the dark hallway. They only had to make a few more steps to the living room, where they uncovered a scene that could only belong to a horror movie. But before we get into today's story, my name is Andrea Scott, and I retell scary true stories that you probably have not heard of. So if that's something that might interest you, then do stick around, because that's what I do every week. A fair warning though, a lot of this content is quite graphic, so viewers and listeners' discretion is advised. Now go get yourself a nice refreshing matcha iced latte with a touch of honey, and let's get started with today's episode called The Lines of Truth. It was an early morning of December 1993, and a 71-year-old Stanislava was making herself a cup of tea. Stanislava lived alone in a simple one-bedroom house in a small mountain town in the Semilsko region in the Czech Republic. All by her old age, Stanislava liked keeping fit as much as she could. She loved going on long walks around where she lived, as the region provided some beautiful hikes in the mountains. She also liked to gather fresh water from the local spring, and she would usually stop and chat with her friends and neighbors that would pass her by. And that morning was no different. Stanislava sat down next to her window that was looking out into her garden and sipped her tea. She loved looking outside, watching the world go by in the mornings. She lived in this house for as long as she could remember, but doing her small routines every day brought her a lot of joy and happiness. Stanislava did not have any family of her own, but was always very active in her community and well liked by just about everyone. She was always happy to stop for a chat and lend a hand to anyone around her that needed it. She would also go to the local church every Sunday and usually volunteer for any events that would be held in the small town she lived her whole life in. She was truly the heart of her small community. After her teacup was empty, Stanislava carried it over to the kitchen and washed it in the sink. She dried her hands and braced herself over the kitchen counter. She began hatching plans for the rest of the day. She felt like heading to the local spring for some fresh water to refill up her bottle with, and then continuing to town to post some Christmas letters she had recently written. After that, she thought she could get a small bite to eat in her favorite bakery just on the corner of the town square, and chat for a minute with the shop staff to check on any recent news and gossip. It would also be nice, she thought, if in town she bumped into one of her friends. Stanislava hadn't spoken to any of them for the last couple of days, and so she was keen on catching up with them. She thought that she could maybe even invite them over and cook a dinner together that evening. And so Stanislava, now properly ready and excited to start her day, got changed into her warm clothes, grabbed her little sports backpack she always carried everywhere she went, and set off for her day. A little over a week later, Stanislava was home getting ready for bed. She just finished her dinner and was washing up after herself, and was now waiting for her stove to boil the water she had collected earlier that day from the spring again. When the water was ready, she carried it over to her mug and poured it over some herbal tea she used to drink every night before bedtime. She let it sit on the counter for a while, and in the meantime she went to the bathroom to have a quick shower. Stanislava then changed into her nightgown and also put on a warm robe. She then walked back into the kitchen to get her tea and brought it with her to the bedroom. She put the teacup onto her nightstand, switched off all the large lights in the house, and switched on her small lamp that was also sitting on the nightstand. Stanislava, still wearing her robe as she liked to be extra warm, got into her bed. Then she switched on the little radio she had standing right beside her teacup and quickly found her favorite station playing traditional folk music. Stanislava sipped her tea and felt the duvet getting warmer by the minute. This was one of her favorite moments. Just before she fell asleep, she would be perfectly warm and cozy, listening to some of her most favorite tunes. When Stanislava finished her tea, she put the cup back onto the nightstand, turned off the radio and her lamp, rolled over to her other side, and within a few minutes she was fast asleep. It only felt like a few minutes had gone by, and Stanislava was awakened by a strange noise coming from her living room. It seemed that there was a person walking around, knocking things over. This made no sense as nobody else had keys to her house. This would only mean that someone had broken in, which made Stanislava really scared. She quickly flipped on the light, and there, standing right in front of her, was a dark figure she did not recognize. A few days later, an older couple living a few doors down from Stanislava's house were just finishing their breakfast when they noticed that, once again, there was no smoke coming from their longtime neighbor's chimney. They found this quite strange, as this was in the middle of the winter, and so the temperature would be freezing cold in the house without any heating on. And so they decided that after washing up, they would go over to check on Stanislava. They cleared their breakfast table and went on to dress for the outside, and a few minutes later, they were making their way on the snowy path towards Stanislava's house. As they were approaching the small gated fence, the couple noticed that there seemed to be no fresh markings in the snow, meaning nobody seemed to have entered or left for at least a few days. They knew that there was no back door entrance to the house, and so this was the only way to get in and out. They both were starting to feel a bit nervous. They knew Stanislava always stayed home over Christmas and never traveled anywhere else, and even if she did, she would have liked to tell them. So the couple decided to open the small gate, which was always left unlocked, and slowly approached the main door of the house. They knocked and waited a few moments for an answer. When none came, they knocked again and called out Stanislava's name. But again, nobody answered. So the wife tried the door and surprisingly found it open. And it looked like it actually had been opened by force, not by a key. By now, the couple was definitely feeling alarmed. They considered for a moment to just turn around and call the police right there and then, but equally their neighbor might need their help right now, and so they looked at each other and agreed to go inside. As they stepped into the small hallway, they immediately noticed Stanislava's things lying all around on the floor as if they had been knocked over and down. The couple thought that Stanislava was not the tidiest of the persons, but equally this didn't seem right. They continued into the living room and then just froze. The entire room looked as if it had been turned upside down. Drawers were pulled out and emptied, furniture was broken and scattered around, and generally everything was knocked over and lying on the floor, making it impossible to tell if Stanislava or anyone at all was still there. But then the couple noticed a red smear on the floor and walls leading to the bedroom. They decided to follow it, and at the end of it, they found their longtime neighbor wrapped up in bedding and crumpled on the floor, not breathing or moving in any way. There was blood everywhere. It looked like someone threw a bucket of blood onto the floor, bed, and Stanislava herself. That's how horrific the scene was. The couple gathered that there was nothing they could do for Stanislava, and they also knew that this was now a crime scene, so they quickly turned around and rushed to the phone to call the police. When the officers arrived, they confirmed that Stanislava was indeed deceased, but they were taken aback by how gruesome the murder scene was. There were blood spatters everywhere, on the floor, furniture, walls, and even the ceiling. It looked like such a violent attack. They just could not imagine who would be able to do such a thing to a helpless old woman. Plus, around where they lived, such crimes were sort of unheard of. Sure, break-ins and burglaries were happening, of course, but never with such an aftermath as this one. Police could see that the perpetrator was clearly looking for something as the house was completely trashed, but they didn't know if anything at all was missing at this point, and so all they could do was to secure any pieces from the scene that could be relevant. The coroner arrived a little while later and immediately got to work. He determined that Stanislava suffered injuries from being beaten with a blunt object, and he also found marks from strangulation. This was ultimately determined to be the cause of Stanislava's death, which he thought occurred somewhere between midnight and 2 o'clock 2 days prior. Everyone on the scene was just shocked by it all. This was a small community, and the word would get out fast, and everyone would be demanding the killer was caught quickly. The police had no real clue where to begin, as the scene did not give much in terms of evidence, since the entire place was in such a bad condition. They decided to start with interviewing the neighbors and Stanislava's closest friends. They found out that Stanislava did not have any immediate family. She was well liked and was not known to keep any expensive things in her home, so it just made no sense to anyone why on earth would someone target her small house when there was unlikely to be anything of value. And so they decided to look at known criminals and petty thieves from within the region. It could be that the perpetrator did not know whose house they were breaking into, and so they could have thought that there were valuables inside. Or they were very desperate, and so they thought robbing an old woman would be an easy and a quick thing to do. The police started with bringing in a few suspects they had on file. The detectives did not think that such a brutal crime was done by a woman, and so they decided to pursue a couple of men they had dealings with before. One of those two men proved to have a bulletproof alibi, and so the police was left with only one suspect. This man was a known criminal from around the area who was always getting into all sorts of trouble and seemed to never have any money. During his first interrogation, he insisted that he had been out drinking with a couple of friends the night of Stanislava's murder. He seemed to be willing to help the police with the investigation as much as he could, though the more he said, the more police were convinced that he must have had something to do with the murder. This was because the more the man said about what he thought could have happened that night, the more the murder scene started to make sense. And unless you were at the scene, there is no way this man could have just guessed most of the information he was providing. And so the police decided to ask the man to undergo a lie detector test, also known as a polygraph. And to their surprise, he agreed. So the same day, the test was set up, and in no time, the suspect, a 31-year-old man called Roman, was fitted with all the straps and wires and sat down to start answering the questions police had prepared for him. At first, everything seems to check out. But then, Roman was getting more and more nervous as the questions got focused on the murder itself. He started changing his theories, turning everything he had previously said to the police upside down. And when the questions were finished, Roman was visibly glad for the procedure to be over. In the meantime, the detectives were reviewing the results of the interrogation, and they quickly found out that Roman had been deceitful. And so they approached him and said that they knew he had lied. And at that moment, with nowhere else to turn to, Roman finally confessed and would end up telling the police the whole story. Based on interviews, evidence found at the crime scenes and investigation conducted, here is what police really think happened on the night of Stanislava's murder. It was a cold December night, and the killer just finished drinking in a bar with a couple of his friends. When they stumbled out of the place, the killer found himself yet again without any money, and so he said he was done for the night and that he would see them again some other time. Then he walked over to his car and drove off. On the way home, he started to get mad at himself. He seemed to have the ability to just burn through money, and with no work at the moment, he had no idea where his next paycheck was going to come from. He was driving slowly through the snowy town when an idea popped into his head. He could just go and rob some house. After all, this neighborhood was full of old people's homes, and so they were bound to have some savings or gold lying around in their homes. And so Roman looked around the street and parked outside of a small house, Stanislava's house. It looked fairly easy to get into, and he also knew that supposedly there was only one old woman living there, so he should not have any troubles with executing his plan. He pulled out a crowbar that he had always lying underneath his front passenger seat and took a deep breath. "Get in and out before the woman wakes up," he said to himself. "The crowbar is only for the locked door, not for anything else," he promised himself. Roman got out of the car and hid the crowbar underneath his coat, just in case anybody was looking out onto the street. He crept towards the small gated fence, which swung open as he tried the handle. Within a few seconds, he was going up the 3 steps towards the front door. He was fairly drunk, and so he stumbled a bit on the slightly icy front porch. He tried the door, but it was locked. He swore and pulled out a crowbar. With a few blows to the lock, he managed to open it. He stepped inside the house, which was drenched in darkness. Roman thought that this was a good sign and continued walking deeper into the house. He didn't know the layout of any of it, and so he kept bumping into the furniture and walls, knocking things over. He grew more and more frustrated at the situation and himself for making so much noise. He got to the small living room and started looking around. He saw a cabinet with some drawers and decided to ruffle through them, but found nothing. He angrily threw some papers onto the floor and swore some more. He aimlessly walked around the room, trying more cabinet doors and drawers, but continued to find nothing. Then he saw a light come on in the room adjacent to the living room, and so Roman panicked. He ran towards the light and suddenly stood towering over an old woman who, sitting upright in her bed, was looking very scared. Roman took another step towards her, and the old lady started shouting for help. He screamed at her to be quiet, but the old lady would not stop shouting for help. And so in a panicked moment, Roman leapt towards her and grabbed a hold of her, trying to silence her. But the old woman started to put up a fight, and that made Roman even angrier. He pulled out a crowbar, which was still tucked in his jacket, and aimlessly started beating the lady with it. Stanislava was trying to shield herself from the heavy blows, but her attacker was so much bigger and stronger than her that she couldn't do anything but plead for her life. But Roman was not stopping. By now, the crowbar and Roman were covered in blood, but the old lady was still crying for help. Roman took a minute to compose himself and looked around the room to see what else he could use to finish the old lady off with. In the moment when Roman turned around, Stanislava made her final move to escape. She managed to get onto all her fours and, as quiet as she could manage, she started to shuffle towards the living room. She made it half across the living room when Roman noticed her. In a drunken rage, he ran towards her, grabbed her by the ankles and started pulling her back into the bedroom. Stanislava tried grabbing hold of objects around her, but to no avail. Roman dragged her by the bed and flipped her over so to face her, and then with all his strength, he started squeezing her neck with his bare hands, slowly suffocating her. Stanislava tried as best as she could to fight Roman off, but there was nothing she could do. And so, after a few moments, Stanislava's body went limp, and Roman knew she was finally dead. Roman stopped squeezing Stanislava's neck and sat down next to her lifeless body. This is not how his plan was supposed to go. Not only did he not find any money or valuables, but he also killed a completely helpless woman. Roman looked at Stanislava's body. He had managed to inflict so much damage that there was blood everywhere he could see. Roman stood up and started gathering the bedding to toss it over Stanislava. And as he was doing that, he noticed that under her covers lay a small sports rucksack. He pulled it towards him and opened it, and his jaw fell to the ground. The rucksack was filled with cash. Roman did not know how much there was stashed in there, but he had never seen so much cash before. And so, feeling finally accomplished, Roman threw more bedding onto Stanislava's body, grabbed the rucksack and left the house as if nothing happened. When Roman got home, he eagerly sat at his kitchen table and started counting the money, and to his surprise there was about 400,000 Czech crowns, which in 2024's conversion would be just under 1.5 million Czech crowns, so around 47,000 British pounds or 60,000 US dollars. This clearly were Stanislava's lifelong savings, and she was known to always carry this little rucksack around her wherever she went. Roman started to sweat. He was beginning to fear that if he tried using the stolen money, he would be caught. And so, in a panicked state, he decided that the best way forward was to burn the cash in the hope of leaving no trace behind. Roman confessed to the police that he managed to do that on the same night of the crime, and that now he felt like he wasted the old woman's life for absolutely nothing. In the end, for the brutality of the attack, Roman was sentenced to 17 years in prison, and currently we have no information about his life or whereabouts. And so this marks the end of today's episode. If you enjoyed it and took anything from it, then please do visit my channel because there are more videos like this waiting for you there. I plan on releasing a brand new episode every week, and so with that, I shall see you all very soon. Until next time.